There are women who live their entire lives in silence. They stay silent when they are looked down upon, silent when they are oppressed, and silent even when their dignity is trampled in front of others. I used to be one of those women. I once thought that as long as I was gentle, enduring, and compliant, my marriage would be peaceful. I used to believe that being the wife of a successful CEO and a daughter-in-law in a wealthy, old-money family meant I had to accept taking a step back. But I never expected that my very submission would turn me into someone they referred to as gutter trash. The day my husband, a powerful corporate executive, threw the divorce papers onto the table, his eyes were full of contempt, and his voice was ice cold. A worthless nobody like you doesn't deserve to stand beside me. I didn't cry. I just smiled quietly. Because in that very moment, he had absolutely no idea that the woman he was forcing to sign the divorce papers was the exact same person holding the fate of his entire corporation and his father's legacy in the palm of her hand. I raised my head, looked straight at the father and son, and slowly delivered a sentence that made the room fall dead silent. Fine, I will sign. But you and your father should prepare to receive your termination notices. And that was the exact moment everything began to turn upside down. I married Harrison on a lightly raining afternoon in early summer. Back then, everyone said I had hit the jackpot. A pristine white wedding gown, a luxurious ballroom at the plaza, and a line of black limousines stretching down Fifth Avenue. People looked at me with envy, while I naively thought I was stepping into a beautiful new chapter of my life, a place with love, protection, and a true family. But only a few months later, I realized that there are massive mansions with absolutely no room for a woman who possesses self-respect. My in-laws lived in a sprawling 3-story estate in a highly exclusive gated community in Greenwich, Connecticut. Black wrought iron gates, polished cobblestone driveways, and security cameras mounted everywhere. On my first day as a daughter-in-law, I stood before those gates with a heavy heart, feeling as though I was stepping into a place where I did not belong. My mother-in-law, Eleanor, was a woman who was always impeccably put together. Her hair was always perfectly styled, her lipstick bold, her gaze sharp and cold. On my very first morning, she handed me a long list of duties required of the daughter-in-law of this household. Her voice was soft, but left zero room for resistance. We have housekeepers, but as the daughter-in-law, you must know your place. Wake up a little earlier, oversee the meals for the family. That is how a proper wife behaves. I nodded. I always nodded. My father-in-law, Arthur, spoke less. But every time he looked at me, his eyes scrutinized me like a cheap asset his son had acquired, wondering how long it would last and if it was worth the money. He was the founder of their Manhattan-based investment firm. Although he had handed the CEO title over to Harrison, every major decision still had to go through him. As for Harrison, my husband at first, he was still gentle, but as time passed, he grew colder. Our shared dinners became scarce, and our conversations devolved into sterile, polite inquiries. He constantly came home late. Sometimes he would only spend one night a week at home. Work is demanding. Be understanding, he would say, before turning his back to me. I was understanding. I endured. I told myself that men doing big business faced immense pressure. But pressure is not an excuse for a man to disrespect his wife. Everything became glaringly clear during my father-in-law's birthday party. That evening, the Greenwich estate was brilliantly lit. High society guests flowed in and out faces of the elite, speaking loudly, laughing boisterously, raising champagne flutes in endless toasts. I wore a modest beige evening dress, nothing revealing, nothing overly elaborate, and stood quietly beside my husband to greet the guests. I had prepared Arthur's gift well in advance, a classic vintage pocket watch. It wasn't flashy, but it was elegant and suited his age. When I presented the gift, I bowed my head respectfully. "Wishing you good health, Dad." He just grunted a brief and set the unopened box aside. Meanwhile, my mother-in-law glanced at it and smirked. A watch? As if this house lacks watches. But fine, it's the thought that counts. Her words were light as air, but they sliced into my heart like a razor blade. Just as the atmosphere was reaching its peak, the grand double doors opened. A woman walked in tall, confident, wearing a form-fitting red dress. The clicking of her Christian Louboutin heels against the marble floor echoed sharply. She didn't need an introduction. She walked straight into the center of the party. I recognized her immediately. Chloe, Harrison's executive assistant. She approached my in-laws and flashed a smile so intimate it made me freeze. "Wishing you health and happiness, Arthur." "Eleanor, is your stomach still bothering you? How was that imported tea I sent over last time?" My mother-in-law's tone instantly shifted to sheer warmth. "Oh, Chloe, sweetheart, you are so thoughtful." It made me feel so much better. I stood beside them, like a redundant piece of furniture. Harrison stepped forward too. The look in his eyes when he looked at Chloe was entirely different from how he looked at me. His voice softened dramatically. "Why didn't you text me? I would have come out to get you." Chloe giggled softly. "I didn't want to bother you." The guests around us began to whisper. Fragments of their gossip drifted into my ears. "She's an assistant, but she acts like the lady of the house. I heard she's brilliant. The company thrives because of her. The CEO's wife is too meek. She doesn't know how to keep her man." I stood there, my hands freezing cold, my heart pounding so hard I thought everyone could hear it. When it was time to cut the cake, my mother-in-law suddenly spoke up, her voice loud, carrying a tone that was half joking, half deadly serious. "Harrison, honestly, a successful man needs a woman of equal caliber standing beside him. Not just anyone is fit to be the lady of a house like this." The room went silent for a split second. I turned to look at Harrison. I waited for him to defend me. Just one sentence was all I needed. But he just offered a dismissive smile. "Mom is just blunt. It's Dad's birthday, let's just let it go." That sentence officially pushed me down to the position of an unwanted outsider in front of everyone. Later that night, after the party ended, I went up to the master bedroom early. Out on the balcony, Harrison was on his phone. His voice was lowered, but every word still found its way to my ears. "Yeah, I know. I'll handle it. She's docile. She'll just sign it." I stood paralyzed behind the glass door. She. He referred to his own wife like a complete stranger. I didn't sleep that night. I lay staring at the ceiling, tears soaking my pillow, not daring to make a sound. For the first time, I asked myself what I had done wrong. The next morning, my mother-in-law looked at me and smirked. "Standing next to Chloe last night, you looked like the maid standing next to the boss." She laughed. My sister-in-law laughed along. But for the first time, I didn't force a polite smile. I set my coffee mug down on the table, looked up, and spoke slowly. "I'll remember you said that, Eleanor." No one knew that right then. Something inside me had fundamentally shifted. It wasn't loud. It wasn't explosive. But it was definitive. I no longer wanted to endure. And from that very moment, the trajectory of all their lives began to veer toward a completely different path. After that birthday party, the massive estate suddenly felt suffocating. Everything was still sparkling clean, still perfectly organized, but the air inside the house had changed. It was no longer a silent, underlying coldness. It was now a blatant, palpable exclusion. Harrison didn't speak to me for 2 straight days. He left early and came home late. When he was home, he locked himself in his study. He didn't ask me a single question, and I didn't ask him any, either. I was beginning to understand a very bitter truth. When someone has already decided to discard you, any explanation you offer becomes utterly redundant. On the morning of the 3rd day, Eleanor called me down to the living room. Her voice was remarkably casual. "Come down here. Arthur and Harrison have something to discuss with you." The living room was brighter than usual that day. The heavy drapes were pulled all the way back, allowing the harsh sunlight to pour directly onto the cream-colored leather sofas. Arthur sat rigidly in the master armchair, both hands resting on his familiar walking cane. Harrison sat beside him, his back straight, his face as cold as stone. On the glass coffee table sat a stack of documents. The moment I saw it, my chest tightened. "Sit down," Arthur said, his tone flat. I sat opposite them. No one offered me a glass of water. Harrison slid the stack of papers toward me. "Sign it." I picked it up, a petition for dissolution of marriage. Everything was happening so fast, it was almost comical. No arguments, no tears, not a single question asking what I thought. It was as if they had finished negotiating this deal ages ago, and I was just the vendor called in to finalize the paperwork. I flipped through the pages. The clauses were explicitly clear. I was to leave the house with absolutely nothing. I waived all rights to alimony or marital assets. I was barred from interfering with or associating with the company, and I was bound by a strict non-disclosure agreement regarding the family's private affairs. I let out a laugh. A very soft laugh. "You worked fast," I said. Harrison frowned. "Don't play games. Just sign it and get it over with. You know your place." I looked up at him. For the first time, I looked at Harrison very closely. This man used to be my husband. We had held hands at the altar. But right now, his eyes held zero affection, only annoyance mixed with disgust. "What exactly is my place?" I asked. Harrison smirked. "You know it perfectly well. You have no pedigree, no financial backing, and you've contributed absolutely nothing of value. Here, you're just a freeloader." Eleanor, who was walking down the grand staircase, chimed in. "Clara, dear, let's be honest. You simply don't fit in this family. A man like Harrison needs a woman of equal standing. You are far too meek, and a meek woman cannot hold on to her husband." I looked at her. Or maybe I just can't hold on to power. The room went dead silent. Arthur tapped his cane lightly against the hardwood floor. "Enough. This ends here. Sign the papers, and this family will let you leave with a shred of dignity." I set the papers back down on the table. My hands were perfectly steady. So steady that it surprised even me. "What if I don't sign?" Harrison scoffed. "You think you have a choice. If you don't sign, it won't do you any good. You'll still walk out of this house with nothing." I looked at each of them. My father-in-law, who always treated me like a defective commodity. My mother-in-law, who had been praying for a new lady of the house. And Harrison, who had chosen betrayal a long time ago, merely waiting for the right moment. I suddenly recalled that phone call on the balcony. She's docile. She'll just sign it. I let out a quiet breath and stood up. "Fine," I said. "I will sign." Harrison paused for a second, then quickly shoved a Mont Blanc pen toward me. I held the pen, but before putting ink to paper, I looked up and offered a calm, unbothered smile. "I just want to say one thing first." Harrison lost his patience. "Make it quick." I looked him dead in the eyes, then shifted my gaze to his father. "After I sign this, you and your father should prepare yourselves." Arthur narrowed his eyes. "Prepare for what?" I set the pen down and spoke slowly, enunciating every word so clearly that no one could possibly mishear. "Prepare to receive your termination notices." The room froze. Eleanor's jaw dropped. "What? What did you just say?" Harrison burst into laughter, though it sounded incredibly forced. "Are you insane? Who do you think you are?" I didn't answer. I just looked at him, my eyes terrifyingly calm. "You'll find out soon enough," I said softly. "Very soon." I signed my name with sharp, decisive strokes. No trembling, no hesitation. When I put the pen down, I felt an extraordinary lightness, as if a crushing weight I had carried for years had just been lifted off my shoulders. I stood up, gave my former in-laws one final, polite bow. "Thank you for the time we shared." Then, I turned and walked away. Behind me, Harrison yelled, "Don't come back begging." I didn't turn around, because I knew the person who would soon be begging was not going to be me. I left that Greenwich estate on a late afternoon, just as the sun dipped behind the manicured mansions. I didn't have massive suitcases or piles of belongings. I only carried a small tote bag containing a few sets of clothes, my ID, and an old laptop. When the heavy wrought iron gates clicked shut behind me, the sound was faint, but in my soul, it echoed like a definitive period at the end of a long sentence. I didn't cry. It was strange. Throughout my years of marriage, I had cried so much. I cried in the shower. I cried with my face buried in pillows, crying quietly so no one would hear. Yet now, when I was officially severed from them, my heart felt empty but incredibly light. I ordered an Uber. As the car rolled down the driveway, I looked in the rearview mirror. The sprawling estate slowly retreated into the distance, growing smaller until it disappeared completely. a massive chunk of my life vanished along with it. I didn't go back to my parents' house right away. I rented a small, quiet apartment in Queens, New York. It was enough space for me to think, and enough space to start over. On my first night there, I sat by the window, opened my laptop, and logged into an account I had barely touched in 2 years. It was my old corporate email. Unread messages populated the screen, familiar names, polite but highly respectful greetings. I took a deep breath. I used to be my own person. I had simply forgotten her for far too long. Meanwhile, back in the Greenwich mansion, they were already celebrating their victory. Eleanor was ecstatic. She was calling her country club friends, boasting that they had finally taken care of the incompatibility issue. My former sister-in-law was scrolling through bridal boutiques online, laughing. We're getting a real lady of the house soon. And Harrison? He felt relieved. He stood in his home office, swirling a glass of bourbon, wearing a smug smile. In his mind, everything was perfect. No more unworthy wife, no more enduring those submissive eyes that quietly irritated him. And very soon, Chloe would officially stand by his side. Chloe walked in right at that moment. She no longer used her formal Mr. Harrison tone. Her voice was soft, but her eyes brimmed with confidence. "Is it done, honey?" Harrison nodded. "Done." She signed. Chloe smiled a smile that no longer needed to be hidden. "I knew it. She's too passive." She sat down on the leather chair opposite him, crossing her legs, adopting the posture of someone who had already claimed the title of the room's next master. "So, when are you going to tell your parents about us?" she asked, half joking, half serious. Harrison hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Let's give it a little time, but it won't be long." Chloe didn't push further. She just smiled. In her mind, I was already an erased name, a failed woman who walked away with nothing, completely unworthy of mention. But right at that exact second, Harrison's phone buzzed, a new email notification. The subject line was remarkably brief. "Urgent. Emergency board meeting." Harrison frowned. The company had been stable for days. No major projects were in jeopardy. He opened the email. The content was only a few lines long, but it made all the color drain from his face. Requirement: the executive board and major shareholders must be present at tomorrow morning's meeting. Agenda: comprehensive review of executive management structure and operational liabilities. Sender: Independent Audit and Oversight Committee. Chloe tilted her head, noticing his screen. She looked slightly surprised. "Is something wrong?" Harrison shook his head, trying to maintain his composure. "It's nothing. Probably just administrative protocol." But he didn't sleep that night. Because this wasn't the first time the company had received a letter from the Independent Audit Committee. And every time they did, it was never a small matter. Meanwhile, in my rented apartment, I was brewing a hot cup of chamomile tea. I opened my laptop and reviewed an old compliance report. The warm lamplight cast a profoundly serene glow on my face. I hadn't been lying when I told them to prepare for their termination notices. They just had no idea where I was standing on this chessboard. The next morning, I walked out of my apartment. I was dressed simply, in a sharp, tailored pantsuit. I took a cab to a mid-sized, highly discreet corporate building in Manhattan. The receptionist saw me, immediately stood up, and gave a respectful nod. "Good morning, Miss Clara." I nodded back. In the high-level conference room on the top floor, a few people were already seated. They were all faces I knew well, though I hadn't seen them in a long time. "You're finally back," a middle-aged man said with a warm smile. I sat down and placed my bag on the empty chair beside me. "I only come back when it's necessary," I replied. A thick dossier was slid across the mahogany table toward me. The cover bore the logo of Harrison's Corporation. "Everything is ready," the man continued. "We are just waiting for your directive." I opened the file and flipped through the pages. Numbers, audit trails, explicit documentation of corporate violations. I felt no emotional surge. I just felt that the timing was perfect. I remembered Harrison's disdainful eyes when he said, "You've contributed absolutely nothing of value." I gave a faint smile. "All right then," I said, my voice soft but absolute. "Let's begin." At that exact moment, In the boardroom of his own company, Harrison walked in looking tense. His father, Arthur, was seated at the head of the table. His eyes lacked their usual piercing arrogance. The meeting commenced, and when the name Clara was mentioned during the committee's briefing, Harrison felt a strange, chilling familiarity wash over him. But he had no idea how terrifying it was about to get. Boardroom 12 was packed tighter than usual that day. The atmosphere was so oppressive that even the scraping of a chair against the floor echoed loudly. Harrison had walked in nodding to familiar faces, forcing the calm demeanor of a CEO accustomed to high-stakes meetings. But only he knew his palms were sweating. Arthur sat rigidly, but he kept checking his Rolex and leaning over to whisper to his secretary. The meeting was called to order. The representative from the Independent Audit Committee stood up. His voice was measured but sharp. Slides appeared on the massive projector. Revenue, profit margins, financial disclosures. Initially, nothing seemed abnormal. Harrison began to let out a breath, thinking to himself that he had been overly paranoid. But then the next slide appeared. The bolded header read, "Review of Executive Management and Individual Liabilities." Murmurs rippled through the room. The representative continued, "During our audit, we discovered that several executive decisions showed clear signs of overreach, alongside multiple transactions, lacking financial transparency." Harrison's head snapped up. His heart hammered against his ribs. The next slide revealed specific figures, exact dates, and several names circled in red. And then, Harrison's name appeared. Not just once. The room fell dead silent. Harrison half stood up from his leather chair. Those decisions were made with the consensus of executive leadership. The auditor didn't even look at him, calmly replying, "We will address that section shortly." The slide transitioned. Arthur's name appeared. This time, the murmurs vanished, replaced by an intense silence. My former father-in-law gripped his cane so tightly his knuckles turned white. His face drained of color. "What exactly are you trying to imply here?" Arthur barked, his voice trembling with rage. The auditor turned to look at him. "We are simply presenting the facts as they appear in the documentation." Suddenly, the heavy boardroom doors swung open. Every eye in the room darted toward the entrance. I walked in. No extravagant designer dresses, no heavy makeup. I wore a minimalist, charcoal business suit, my hair tied back neatly, holding a single, slim file folder. But the second I appeared, the entire room seemed to freeze solid. Harrison stared at me, his eyes wide, his voice cracking. What are you doing here?" I ignored him. I gave a polite nod to the audit committee and took a seat in the empty, high-backed chair placed deliberately at the center of the table. The lead auditor offered a faint smile. "Allow me to introduce Miss Clara, the majority proxy representative and independent advisor for our investment coalition." Every word hit like a sledgehammer. Harrison violently whipped his head toward his father. Arthur had completely lost his composed facade. His face was ashen, his lips trembling. "Impossible," Harrison muttered. She's my wife." I turned to look at him. My gaze was entirely serene. "Actually, no," I said slowly. "I am your ex-wife." A collective gasp echoed in the room. I opened my folder and placed it on the table. "I believe we should cut straight to the point," I said. "The decisions that Mr. Harrison and Mr. Arthur have executed over the past 2 years have posed severe systemic risks to this corporation. And I am here to propose the immediate course of action." Harrison slammed his hands on the table. "You have no authority here." I smiled. "Are you sure about that?" I gestured to the auditor. A new slide illuminated the screen. It was the most recently updated shareholder registry and voting rights distribution. My name sat squarely in the controlling voting block. Harrison collapsed back into his chair. It was as if all the bones in his body had melted. "No way," he whispered. "Where did you get that?" I didn't bother explaining, because there are certain truths that, by the time people like them find out, they no longer deserve an early warning. The auditor took over. "Based on the findings of the audit and the motion put forth by the majority proxy, we recommend the immediate suspension of Mr. Harrison from the role of Chief Executive Officer. Furthermore, we demand that Mr. Arthur step down entirely from all direct operational involvement." The room held its breath. "This is absurd," Arthur roared, leaning heavily on his cane to stand. "I built this company from the ground up." I looked at him. My voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like glass. "Which is exactly why we must stop you before you tear it all down." Harrison turned to me, his eyes wide with a chaotic mix of panic and deep regret. "Clara, please, listen to me. There must be a misunderstanding. We can talk about this." I looked at him, and for the first time, I felt absolutely zero pain. "Harrison," I said, "when you threw those divorce papers on the table, you made your choice." No one said another word. The meeting concluded with a formal vote. The motion was passed overwhelmingly. As everyone filed out of the room, Harrison remained frozen in his chair, staring blankly ahead. Arthur walked out first, his posture nowhere near as steady as when he had entered. I was the last to stand. Before I walked out the door, I paused and looked back, making sure my voice carried clearly to the father and son. "Thank you for teaching me a valuable lesson. Never underestimate a woman just because she chooses to be silent." The heavy boardroom doors clicked shut, and behind them, a family that once thought they were invincible began to shatter into pieces. The meeting was over, but its shockwaves didn't stop at the doors of Boardroom 12. The news spread faster than anyone could have predicted. In the span of a single afternoon, the entire Manhattan headquarters was buzzing. Employees whispered in the break rooms, exchanging knowing glances, half-finished sentences, and quiet sighs. The name Harrison, once the absolute symbol of corporate authority, was now spoken in an entirely different tone. Hesitant, suspicious, and distant. Harrison returned to his corner office and slammed the door shut. The familiar, luxurious space suddenly felt alien. His massive mahogany CEO desk was right there, but he no longer dared to sit behind it like he used to. He leaned against the edge of the desk, gripping it with both hands, panting heavily. For the first time in his life, Harrison felt terror, not the fear of losing money, or even losing his title. It was the terrifying realization that he had been fundamentally, catastrophically wrong about who I was. The door burst open. Chloe walked in. Her trademark confident smile was gone. Her lipstick seemed faded, and her eyes darted around anxiously. "Harrison, what is going on?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady, though she couldn't hide her panic. Harrison turned to look at her, as if he was truly seeing her for the first time. "You don't know?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Chloe shook her head. "I just heard you were temporarily suspended. But, Clara, what does it mean? Why is everyone calling her the majority proxy?" Harrison let out a laugh, but it was a deeply bitter, hollow sound. "I just found out this morning myself," he said. "The woman you called too passive is the exact person who decides whether or not I get to keep sitting in this chair." Chloe took a step back. "That's impossible," she muttered. She was always so quiet. She never said a word. Harrison looked at her, his eyes full of dripping sarcasm. "Did you really think real power always has to put on a show?" Chloe went silent. Inside her mind, every grand plan she had meticulously drawn up was beginning to disintegrate. The Greenwich estate, the title of the CEO's wife, the high society galas, all of it suddenly became as fragile as a soap bubble. "So, what about us?" Chloe asked quietly, her voice beginning to tremble. Harrison didn't answer immediately. He turned his back to her, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows. Outside, the streets of Manhattan were packed and bustling, but he felt like he had been entirely left behind. "Go home, Chloe," Harrison said. "I need to be alone." Chloe frowned. "Are you kicking me out?" Harrison turned around, his eyes exhausted. "I don't have the mental capacity for this right now." For the first time, Chloe felt the sting of being cast aside. A feeling I had endured for years, being abandoned in the very place you thought was your sanctuary. She left the office, walking briskly. The long corporate hallway suddenly felt terrifyingly empty. At the same time, back in the Greenwich estate, my former mother-in-law was pacing frantically. She kept calling Harrison, but it went straight to voicemail. She called Chloe, but Chloe didn't pick up either. News from the company had reached her ears through phone calls from her country club friends, and every call was a fresh knife twisting into her mounting panic. "It's impossible," she muttered to herself. "What could that girl possibly do?" But the more she denied it, the more she realized an undeniable truth. Her family was rapidly losing all control. That evening, I received a phone call from an unknown number. "Clara, it's Mom." Eleanor's voice was stripped of its usual arrogance. It was lower, slower, and carried a slight tremor. "I have something I need to talk to you about." I stayed quiet for a few seconds before answering. "Go ahead, Eleanor." "About the harsh things I said the other day. Please don't hold them against me," she stammered. "At the end of the day, we are still family." I let out a soft laugh. Not a laugh of mockery, but a laugh acknowledging that everything had finally revealed its true nature. "Eleanor," I said slowly, "the second I signed those divorce papers, I ceased being your family." Silence hung on the line, but she quickly pleaded, "We can talk this over. We're family, right, sweetheart?" I looked out my apartment window. The amber streetlights reflecting off the glass looked warm and peaceful. "Family isn't a place you only remember when you need something," I said. "Take care of your health, Eleanor." I hung up. No anger, no resentment. It was just over. That night, I sat alone brewing a cup of tea, opening up my long-neglected strategic planning documents. My life no longer revolved around being a good daughter-in-law, a submissive wife, or proving my worth to anyone. I realized something very clearly. They didn't lose me because I wasn't good enough. They lost me because they lacked the intelligence to recognize my value. And somewhere in the city, Harrison was sitting in the dark, replaying every past moment, finally understanding that losing a meek woman was not a victory. It was the genesis of his total ruin. 3 days after that fateful board meeting, I received the official news. Harrison was formally and indefinitely suspended from all executive duties. Arthur, his father, was forced into full retirement, stripped of any direct operational roles. The company was temporarily placed under the control of a transition management team, and all major decisions had to pass through the board and the shareholders. The news wasn't blasted on CNN or CNBC, but in the elite corporate circles of Wall Street, it spread like wildfire. The family that was once considered an untouchable dynasty found itself isolated in a matter of days. As for me, my life moved forward with a comforting normalcy. I woke up early, brewed my own coffee, and opened the windows to let the morning sun into my Queens apartment. I spent my afternoons reviewing portfolios and my evenings cooking simple meals. There was no one barking orders at me, no one criticizing me, no one forcing me to walk on eggshells around their fragile egos. For the first time in years, I felt like I could finally breathe. Until one rainy afternoon, my doorbell rang just as I turned off the stove. I was a bit surprised. I wasn't expecting anyone. I opened the door and froze. Harrison stood before me. No tailored Tom Ford suit, no CEO swagger. He wore a wrinkled button-down shirt, a loose tie. His hair was a mess, and his face was gaunt with dark circles under his eyes. He looked nothing like the man who had thrown divorce papers on the table with absolute contempt. "Clara," his voice was hoarse. "Can I come in and talk?" I stayed silent for a few seconds before swinging the door open wider. Not out of pity, but because I wanted him to face the consequences of his actions in their entirety. Harrison sat down on my small sofa. My modest apartment was a stark contrast to the sprawling luxury of the Greenwich estate. He looked around, his eyes betraying his profound confusion. "You live here?" he asked. "Yes," I replied. "It's exactly enough." Harrison bowed his head, interlacing his fingers tightly. "I'm sorry." Those 3 words. I had waited years to hear them. But right now, they arrived much too late. "I didn't think it would end up like this," he continued. "I had no idea you were in that position." I poured a cup of tea and set it in front of him. "If you had known, you wouldn't have done it," I asked. Harrison looked up, his lips parting, but he couldn't form an answer. His silence was all the answer I needed. "Clara, I know I messed up." His voice trembled. "But we were married. Can you help me?" I stared at him for a long time. The man who once told me I was a nobody. The man who said, "She's docile. She'll sign it." Now, he was sitting in my living room, lowering his voice to beg. "What exactly do you want me to help you with?" I asked. "Just say the word," Harrison pleaded desperately. "If you just say one word, the board will reconsider. I don't need my old job back. I just want to keep a little bit of my dignity." "Dignity?" I let out a soft laugh. Harrison, I said slowly, when you humiliated me in front of everyone, did you think about my dignity? Harrison buried his face in his hands. His shoulders began to shake. And then, he dropped to his knees. The sound of his knees hitting the hardwood floor was soft, but it made the room feel like it was encased in ice. I'm begging you, his voice broke. I truly have nothing left. If I were the woman I used to be, maybe I would have cried. Maybe I would have softened. Maybe I would have thought about the old memories. But the woman I am now saw things with crystal clarity. You still have one thing left, I said. Harrison looked up, a faint glimmer of hope in his eyes. What is it? You have this lesson, I replied, and you will carry it with you for the rest of your life. I stood up and looked down at him. I will not destroy you, but I will not save you either. What you are experiencing right now is the direct consequence of your arrogance and your betrayal. I do not owe you my forgiveness. Harrison collapsed, burying his face in his hands, choking back sobs. You should leave, I said softly. It's raining. He stood up very slowly. Before walking out the door, he turned back. Clara, did you ever truly love me? I looked at him calmly. I did. But you killed it with your own hands. The door clicked shut. I leaned against it, closing my eyes for a long time. No joy, no pain, just the feeling of absolute closure. Outside, the rain continued to fall. And I knew very well, karma isn't about seeking revenge. Karma is watching the person who once treated you like dirt have to live with their regret for the rest of their days. After that board meeting, Chloe stopped appearing by Harrison's side. Not because she didn't want to, but because no one permitted her to be there anymore. In the past, every time Chloe walked through the corporate headquarters, employees would stand up and greet her, their eyes a mix of caution and flattery. She was used to being listened to, being favored, being treated as the CEO's untouchable right hand. The compliments, the nods of approval, the unspoken acknowledgement of her status had made Chloe believe she was far more than an assistant. She truly believed that she was just one step away from replacing me entirely. But after that meeting, everything changed so rapidly that Chloe couldn't even process what was happening. Her emails went unanswered. Her name was scrubbed from meeting invites. The initiatives she proposed were ignored. At first, she thought it was just a coincidence. She told herself that Harrison was just dealing with some temporary corporate turbulence. But by the third day, when a security guard awkwardly stopped her from entering the executive boardroom suites, Chloe felt genuine panic. I have a meeting with Mr. Harrison, Chloe said, trying to maintain her authoritative tone. The security guard checked his tablet and shook his head. I'm sorry, ma'am. You're not on the clearance list today. That sentence was delivered softly, but to Chloe, it felt like a slap across the face. She stood frozen in the middle of the long hallway. The harsh fluorescent lights made her face look pale and hollow. Employees walking by no longer bowed their heads to greet her. They just glanced at her and kept walking, as if she had suddenly become completely irrelevant. Chloe retreated to her office and sank into her chair, her hands trembling slightly. She grabbed her iPhone and dialed Harrison's number. 1 call. 2 calls. 3 calls. No answer. For the first time, Chloe felt the exact sensation I had endured for years, being completely abandoned in the very place you thought was your fortress. By late afternoon, Chloe received an email from Human Resources. The subject line was brief and brutally cold, meeting request. She read the email over and over. Her intuition screamed that this was not going to be a pleasant conversation. The HR department was brightly lit, but the atmosphere was suffocating. The HR director slid a manila folder across the desk toward Chloe, speaking in a deeply professional, detached tone. We have reviewed your role and authorization limits over the past fiscal year. Chloe clenched her fists. Is there a problem? The director looked her dead in the eye. You have vastly exceeded your designated authority, inserted yourself into strategic decisions outside your purview, and there are severe indications of a conflict of interest. Chloe let out a forced laugh. I was following Mr. Harrison's direct orders. We operate based on documentation, the director replied. And the documentation indicates you are solely responsible for your actions. A termination agreement was slid across the desk toward Chloe. No yelling, No arguing, no chance to explain. Chloe stared at the paper, her eyes locked onto the bold print. In her mind, everything collapsed. The Greenwich estate, the title of the CEO's wife, the glorious, wealthy future she had vividly imagined it turned out. It was all just a mirage. Chloe walked out of the corporate building as the late afternoon sun began to set. Her designer dress was still flawless, her heels still clicked against the pavement, but every step felt like lead. No one saw her off. No one checked on her. No one cared. She stopped in front of a large glass storefront, looking at her own reflection. For the first time, Chloe asked herself, "Where did I go wrong?" And then, a chilling answer echoed in her mind. I confused temporary favoritism for actual value. At the exact same time, in a different part of the city, I was sitting in my quiet home office. The afternoon sun filtered through the blinds, casting a warm glow over my perfectly organized desk. I reviewed a report, signed a few final documents for the day, and felt an incredible sense of peace. I didn't feel gloating or vindictive, because I understood the reality perfectly. Chloe wasn't the only one at fault. She was just someone foolish enough to enter a game where the rules were never designed to let her win. I closed the file folder, stood up, and looked out the window. In my mind, there was no lingering image of Chloe, and no lingering anger toward Harrison. There was only one crystal-clear thought. Any relationship built on the degradation of others will eventually collapse. And I knew that what had just happened to Chloe was merely the beginning of a long, painful reality for the people who once called me gutter trash. They would now have to learn how to survive in a world where I was no longer standing behind them to absorb the blows. That afternoon, it wasn't raining, but dark gray clouds blanketed the New York sky. The air felt so heavy that simply opening a window made my chest feel weighed down. I had just gotten home from work. I set my bag down and hadn't even had the chance to change out of my work clothes when the doorbell rang. It was a short, sharp buzz. I froze for a second. For some reason, I had a very strong premonition about who was on the other side. I opened the door, and there she was, my former mother-in-law, Eleanor. She stood there, visibly thinner than before. Her hair was brushed, but it lacked its usual salon-perfect shine. The Hermes Birkin bag she used to parade around had been replaced by a dark, unbranded leather tote. Her eyes were no longer sharp, no longer looking down their nose at the world. Instead, they were a messy cocktail of exhaustion, anxiety, and sheer helplessness. "Clara," she called my name, her voice raspy. "Can I come in and talk to you?" I looked at her for a few seconds. If I were the Clara from a few years ago, I probably would have scrambled to invite her in, terrified of offending her, worried I'd be labeled disrespectful. But now, I just stood completely still, looking clearly at the woman in front of me. This wasn't the tyrannical matriarch of a Greenwich estate anymore. This was just a woman terrified of losing everything. I opened the door. "Come in, Eleanor." My small queen's apartment lacked any semblance of luxury. A simple sofa, a small wooden coffee table, a few potted plants by the window. Eleanor walked in and looked around, a flash of surprise in her eyes. "You live here?" she asked, her voice much smaller than it used to be. "Yes," I replied. "It's enough for me." She sat down, placing both hands on her knees. Her posture was stiff, completely lacking the regal comfort she exuded back at the mansion. It took her a long time to finally speak. I never expected things to turn out like this." I poured a glass of water and set it in front of her. No imported hot tea, no expensive coffee, just tap water. She picked up the glass, her hands trembling slightly. "Do you know?" she started, her voice slow. "Lately, no one visits the house. The phone barely rings. The people who used to call me sister, the people who begged for dinner invites, they've all gone dead silent." I listened quietly. "Arthur just sits and stares at the wall all day. Harrison, he barely speaks to anyone." She choked up. "I just didn't think everything could collapse so fast." She looked up at me, her eyes bloodshot. "Clara, I am so sorry." Those 3 words. If she had said them a few years ago, I might have burst into tears. But now, they just made my heart feel incredibly still. "I'm sorry for looking down on you," she continued. "I'm sorry for saying things I never should have said. I just thought you were so meek, that you were entirely useless." I looked at her, my voice perfectly calm. Eleanor, I said, I was meek not because I was weak, but because I thought that was how you preserved a family. She bowed her head. I know. I know that now. A long silence stretched between us. Then, she reached out and grabbed my hand. The hand that used to issue orders, that used to point fingers, was now shaking. Clara, if you can, could you please help the family just this once? Just one time. I gently pulled my hand away. What exactly do you want me to help with? She took a deep breath. Just say one word. So Arthur and Harrison have a way out. We used to be family, after all. I looked straight into her eyes. Do you remember the day I stood at Arthur's birthday party? I asked. The day you announced in front of a ballroom full of people that I didn't deserve to be there. She froze. Did you consider me family that day? Her lips trembled, but she couldn't form a single word. I stood up and walked over to the window. The fading afternoon sun cast a pale, quiet yellow light into the room. I don't hate you, I said, with my back to her. But I also cannot return to my old role. She burst into tears. I know it's too late. I just never imagined that the person I looked down on the most would be the one holding the power to decide everything. I turned back to look at her. My voice was slow, but absolute. I didn't decide this. The consequences you and Harrison are facing are the direct result of your own actions. She sat in silence for a very long time. When she finally stood up to leave, she paused at the door and turned to me. Clara, if there is a next life, I will never judge someone by their pedigree again. I nodded. I hope so. The door clicked shut. I leaned my back against the wall and let out a long exhale. No relief, no heartbreak. Just a very clear realization. There are relationships that don't end because of burning hatred, but simply because there is absolutely no room left to return to. And from that moment, I knew I had truly walked past the most painful chapter of my life. After Eleanor left, I sat in my small apartment for a long time. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't play any music. I just sat in silence, watching the sunset fade behind the rooftops across the street. I understood something profoundly. Everything had reached the absolute end of a karmic cycle. There was no more anger, no more bitterness, but there was also no hesitation. 3 days later, I attended the final shareholder meeting in my capacity as the architect of the ultimate restructuring plan. The boardroom that day wasn't chaotic like the first time. There were no heated arguments. It was just a suffocatingly heavy atmosphere, as if everyone in the room knew that today, certain doors were going to be locked forever. I arrived early and took my usual seat. In front of me was a thick dossier, a comprehensive compilation of Harrison's and Arthur's executive history over several years. The numbers didn't lie, the signatures couldn't be denied, and the mistakes couldn't be erased with tears. When everyone was seated, I stood up. No microphone, no long-winded corporate speech. I spoke slowly, enunciating every single sentence. I am not here to punish anyone. But I also cannot continue to turn a blind eye. The room was dead silent. This corporation was built on genuine effort, but over the last few years, it has been derailed by emotional decision-making, rampant nepotism, and the prioritization of personal interests over the collective good. A few executives lowered their heads. If we choose to look the other way today, tomorrow we will pay the price with our reputation, the trust of our partners, and the very future of this firm. I opened the dossier and pushed it toward the audit committee. Therefore, I proposed 3 mandates. Every mandate was precise, stripped of any excess words. 1. The complete abolishment of the dynastic management structure. R. No executive roles may be held by direct blood relatives without passing through a transparent, third-party vetting process. 3. No personal vendettas, no public humiliation, and no pushing anyone to the absolute brink, but absolutely no exceptions. Anyone responsible for operational violations must vacate their positions of power. When I finished speaking, the room remained silent for a long time. Then, one by one, the board members nodded. The resolution was passed. No applause, no congratulatory handshakes. It was simply a necessary conclusion. That afternoon, I received the official memo. Harrison was permanently stripped of all corporate authority. Arthur was completely phased out, no honorary titles, no advisory roles. Everything was executed surgically and cleanly. I didn't call Harrison, and I didn't leave a message, because I knew that sometimes silence is the clearest answer you can give. That evening, I went home early. I cooked a simple dinner: hot soup, roasted vegetables, some baked chicken. I ate alone, but I didn't feel lonely. For the first time in years, I felt like I was living for myself, not living to please someone else. I stood in front of the mirror and looked at the woman staring back. She was no longer the wife who kept her head down. She was no longer the daughter-in-law terrified of every judgmental glare. She was just a woman who had walked through enough pain to understand that kindness does not mean letting yourself be trampled, and forgiveness does not mean returning to the place that broke you. And I knew from this moment on, everything ahead of me was my new life. After the final resolution was enacted, Harrison officially left the company he used to stroll into every morning with the swagger of a conqueror. There was no farewell party, no speeches of gratitude, not even a token handshake. He packed up his office late on a Friday afternoon, when most of the staff had already gone home for the weekend. The massive corner office, with its warm ambient lighting highlighting the familiar mahogany furniture, suddenly felt so vast and empty, it made his blood run cold. Harrison opened his desk drawer. Inside, there were still a few old business cards, a custom-engraved Mont Blanc pen, and a small silver picture frame. The photo was of him, me, and his parents at the company's anniversary gala years ago. Back then, everyone was smiling so brightly. Harrison stared at the photo for a long time. Then, he placed it face down and shut the drawer, not out of anger, but because he no longer had the courage to face it. In the days that followed, Harrison existed in a prolonged, deafening silence. He sold his Porsche, once his greatest source of pride, and swapped it for a used, generic sedan. He sold the Greenwich estate to pay off looming personal debts and moved into a small, rented apartment in an outer borough. Everything happened quietly, without media spectacles, but every single decision felt like a blade slicing into his ego. For the first time in his life, Harrison had to go to the grocery store himself. He had to stand in line. He had to calculate the cost of everyday items. Things he had never given a second thought to were now the reality of his daily existence. Once, while standing at a checkout counter, Harrison overheard two men behind him talking. That CEO guy was supposedly a genius. Wonder what happened to him. Genius, sure, but probably way too arrogant for his own good. Harrison lowered his head and pretended to scroll on his phone. He didn't dare turn around, not because he was afraid they'd recognize him, but because they were absolutely right. Harrison started sending out resumes. He applied to mid-level firms, aiming for positions far beneath the C-suite titles he used to hold. Some companies sent polite rejection emails. Some ghosted him entirely. A few called him in for interviews. During one interview, after a few standard questions, the hiring manager's expression shifted. "You used to be the CEO?" "Yes." "So, are you going to be comfortable taking orders from someone else?" That question made Harrison choke. He was used to giving orders. He was used to being obeyed, to being feared, to being revered. Now, he had to learn how to exist at the bottom of the ladder all over again. One evening, Harrison sat alone in his cramped apartment. He opened his laptop, staring at the blank browser screen. Unconsciously, he typed my name into the search bar. Then, he stopped. He realized he no longer had the right to step into my life. He remembered the moment he threw the divorce papers on the table. He remembered his own cold, mocking voice. He remembered the look in my eyes, no tears, no begging, just a profound, quiet stillness. Back then, Harrison thought he had won. Only now did he understand that the ultimate loser is the one who believes they will remain at the top forever. Another night, Harrison received a call from his father. Arthur's voice was incredibly weak, a shadow of its former booming self. "How are you doing, son?" Harrison paused for a few seconds. "I'm fine, Dad." It wasn't the truth, but it was the only thing he could bring himself to say. "I'm sorry," Arthur whispered. "I thought that as long as we had power, nothing else mattered." Harrison squeezed his eyes shut. "I thought the same thing, Dad." The call ended in dead silence. Eventually, Harrison took a job at a small logistics company with a salary just barely enough to cover his rent and bills. No one there knew who he used to be. No one cared about his past. They only cared about what he could deliver that day. And for the first time in his life, Harrison realized a brutal, agonizing truth. A corporate title can be stripped away in a single board meeting, but your character is what you carry with you for the rest of your life. In another corner of the city, I was living my life. No rushing, no looking back. And Harrison, every morning he woke up, he had to face himself in the mirror, stripped of his CEO armor, stripped of his wealthy family's protection. He was just a man learning how to take responsibility for the wreckage he had caused. And that, truly, was the longest sentence of all. After the dust finally settled on all the corporate chaos, I decided to take a trip back to my hometown to visit my parents. I didn't announce my arrival, nor did I pack anything extravagant. It was just a regular Friday afternoon. I grabbed a duffel bag, took a train out of the city, and headed up to a quiet town in upstate New York. My heart felt lighter than I had ever thought possible. The modest, familiar house at the end of the cul-de-sac looked exactly the same. The weathered iron gate, the slightly faded siding, the vibrant lilac bushes blooming brightly in the front yard. I stood by the gate for a moment, suddenly feeling a sharp sting behind my eyes. How many years had it been since I came home on an afternoon like this? I heard my mother's voice calling from the kitchen. "Who is it?" I unlatched the gate and walked in. "It's me, Mom." My mother turned around. She froze for a few seconds, then frantically wiped her hands on her apron and ran over to pull me into a tight embrace. The hug required no words. She just held me so tightly she trembled, as if terrified I might vanish into thin air. "Why didn't you tell me you were coming?" Her voice was thick with emotion. "I missed home," I replied, my throat tightening. My father walked out from the living room. He stared at me for a long time. He didn't say much. He just gave a firm nod and turned back toward the kitchen. "You're home. That's all that matters." Just that one sentence was enough to make my heart shatter and mend all at once. Dinner that night was incredibly simple. Chicken soup, roasted vegetables, and a side of mashed potatoes. The exact kind of mundane, comforting meals I used to take for granted. But now, they felt infinitely precious. My mother kept adding food to my plate, stealing worried glances at me. "Was it really hard for you over there?" I held my fork, my hands shaking slightly. Habit almost made me say, "I'm fine, Mom," just like I always did, but I set the fork down. "Yes," I said softly. "It was very hard." The kitchen fell silent. And then, I started to tell them. I told them about the years of being a daughter-in-law in that mansion, the dinners I ate, swallowing my tears, the condescending remarks, the moment I was forced to sign the divorce papers. At first, my voice was steady, but the more I spoke, the more it broke. I thought if I just endured it, everything would be okay. I didn't want you guys to worry. My mother wept. She cried out loud, her shaking hands resting on the table. "Why were you so foolish, Clara? Why didn't you tell me sooner?" My father turned his face away, his voice dropping into a low, gravelly whisper. "I'm sorry, Clara. I couldn't protect you." That sentence broke the dam. I sobbed. I cried harder than I had in years, not out of pain anymore, but because finally, I was allowed to be exactly where I belonged. After dinner, I sat out on the back porch with my dad. It was dark, the evening breeze was cool, and the crickets were chirping in the grass. "Do you regret it?" my father asked. I thought for a moment, then shook my head. No. If I hadn't gone through it, I wouldn't have known how strong I actually am. My dad nodded, placing a heavy, warm hand on my shoulder. "Remember this. No one on this earth has the right to make you feel inferior." That night, I lay in my old childhood bed, listening to the gentle hum of the ceiling fan. I didn't dream. I didn't toss and turn. I slept a remarkably deep sleep, the kind of sleep only achieved by someone who has truly laid down the ghosts of their past. The next morning, I woke up early. I helped my mom in the garden, sweeping the porch while the soft morning sunlight filtered through the picket fence. I suddenly realized, a home isn't defined by its massive square footage or iron gates. A home is a place where someone is waiting for you to return. And I knew that starting with that simple, home-cooked meal, my life had officially entered a beautiful new chapter. After spending a few days with my parents, I took the train back to the city. But this time, I carried none of the heavy, suffocating dread I used to feel. I returned with a completely different mindset. I wasn't going back to endure, I was going back to live my own life. I moved into an apartment in a quiet neighborhood in Brooklyn. It didn't have a sprawling balcony, and it wasn't filled with designer furniture, but it had brilliant morning sunlight, and it was quiet enough for me to finally hear my own thoughts. On moving day, I only brought a few boxes. Looking at the mostly empty space, I didn't feel deprived. I felt incredibly light. I bought a few small potted plants and set them on the windowsill. Every morning, I watered them. Watching the tiny green leaves sprout, I realized that nurturing something simple was a profoundly effective way to heal myself. My work life stabilized beautifully. I no longer operated from a place of defensiveness, nor did I exhaust myself trying to prove my competence to anyone. I worked my set hours. I stayed highly focused. I kept things professional and distinct. When I needed to say no, I said it directly. When I disagreed with a proposal, I stated my reasons clearly. No beating around the bush, no terror of offending someone. The strange thing was, people respected me far more for it. Once, during a lunch break, a colleague asked me, "Aren't you ever afraid of being judged?" I gave a soft smile. I used to be, but not anymore. Because I had spent years living my life solely to appease others, and I knew exactly how agonizingly expensive that price was. In the evenings, I learned to cook for one. Not massive, elaborate spreads, just simple, hearty meals, but I ate slowly. I enjoyed the food. I no longer swallowed my meals in a rush out of fear that someone would critique my manners or give me a sour look. Some nights, I would turn off all the overhead lights, turn on a small desk lamp, and read. Outside my window, New York City was as loud and chaotic as ever. But inside my four walls, everything was absolute peace. I started a habit of journaling. Not to publish, not to show off online, just to understand myself better. I wrote about my past mistakes, but I didn't beat myself up over them. I wrote about the things I had lost, but I didn't cling to them. I realized a very simple truth. Happiness doesn't come from how many people validate you. Happiness comes from no longer having to betray yourself. One afternoon, I unexpectedly ran into a few old acquaintances from my Greenwich days. They looked at me with genuine surprise. "You look so different lately, Clara." "Different how?" I asked. They thought for a moment before answering. "Lighter. More at peace." I nodded. "You're right. I was no longer carrying the crushing weight of expectations that never belonged to me in the first place. I don't know what the future holds. I haven't drawn up any massive, grand life plans. All I know is that every morning I wake up, I am no longer terrified. I am no longer anxious about bending over backward to please someone else. And to me, that is more than enough. I stood in front of my mirror and looked at the woman staring back. No heavy makeup, no exhausted, fearful eyes. Just a woman who had walked through enough pain to finally understand. Life doesn't need to be dazzling. It just needs to be a life you aren't ashamed to live. And that was the exact moment I knew I had truly stepped out of the shadow of my past. I didn't think I would ever hear from Harrison again. My life was firmly established in its new orbit. Quiet mornings, fulfilling workdays, and evenings in a cozy apartment with warm lamplight. I didn't actively avoid my past, but I didn't let it drag me backward either. Until one evening, while I was sitting by the window reading a book, my phone buzzed. A text message. The name on the screen made me pause for a few seconds. Harrison. I stared at it for a long time. I didn't open it immediately. My heart didn't race, my hands didn't shake. It was just a strange, detached sensation, like stumbling across a very old, familiar item in the attic that you simply have no use for anymore. Finally, I opened the message. "Clara, I don't expect you to reply. I just want to say something I should have said a very long time ago. It's not because I lost everything that I'm saying this, but because I once had everything that I finally see clearly. The most precious thing I ever lost was you. I used to think you were weak, but it turns out you were the strongest person in that house. I wish you a peaceful life, I read the words slowly. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel vindicated. I just felt empty. I set my phone down on the table and walked into the kitchen to pour a glass of water. When I came back, I read the text one more time, not to search for any lingering regrets, but to assure myself that I had truly reached the end of this road. I typed out a very short reply. I am already at peace. I stared at the text bubble for a few seconds. Then, I deleted it. Not because I lacked the courage to send it, but because I understood that some answers are best kept to oneself. That night, I went for a walk. The city lights were brilliant against the dark sky. The traffic was heavy, the sidewalks crowded with people rushing by. I blended into the masses. No one knew who I was. No one cared that I used to be the wife of a CEO or the daughter-in-law of a powerful Greenwich dynasty. And for the first time, I found that anonymity incredibly comforting. A few days later, I ran into Harrison. No advanced warning, no mental preparation. We ended up standing in line together at a small, independent coffee shop in Midtown. When I turned around, I caught his eye. Harrison froze for a second, then gave a slight, hesitant nod. Clara. Yeah, I replied. Just that. No polite inquiries, no placing blame, no bringing up the past. Harrison stood there. He was visibly thinner. He was dressed in generic, off-the-rack clothing. His eyes no longer held their signature, imposing confidence, but they also lacked the arrogant cruelty of the past. He was just a profoundly ordinary man, standing in front of the woman he had thrown away. Are you doing well these days? He asked. I am, I replied, honestly. Harrison was quiet for a few seconds, then offered a faint smile. I'm glad for you. I nodded. We each grabbed our coffees and turned in opposite directions. Neither of us looked back. As I walked out of the coffee shop, I stopped on the sidewalk for a moment and took a deep breath. Not because I was sad, but because I had just realized something monumental. I no longer needed any validation from the person who had hurt me the most. That evening, I went home early and opened the windows to let the cool New York breeze into my apartment. I sat down at my desk and wrote a few lines in my journal. Some people only walk with us for a short distance. Not because we aren't good enough, but because they lack the depth to go any further. I closed the journal, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that the old chapter was permanently closed. I ran into Harrison one last time on an early Monday morning, in the elevator of an older, unassuming office building. No prior arrangement, no mental bracing, just two people who used to be intimately connected, now standing side by side in a cramped space, as silent as total strangers. The elevator doors slid shut. The only sound was the faint hum of the mechanical cables. I stared at the floor indicator panel, while Harrison looked down at the tips of his shoes. I noticed a few strands of gray in his hair. His face was even more hollowed out than when I saw him at the coffee shop. Do you work in this building? Harrison spoke first. His voice was slow and painfully cautious. Yes, I replied. And you? He forced a tight smile. I'm dropping off a resume. I nodded. I didn't ask any follow-up questions. I didn't pry. I realized I truly had zero desire to know how his life was going anymore. The elevator pinged and stopped at the 6th floor. The doors opened, and I stepped out. Clara, Harrison called out. I turned back. I just wanted to say. Harrison hesitated, swallowing hard. I never thought there would be a day where I would stand in front of you, looking like this. I looked at him. My eyes were perfectly serene. That's life, I said. No one stays in the exact same place forever. Harrison fell silent. He looked like he wanted to say something else, but ultimately stopped himself. I gave a polite nod and turned to walk down the hall. Behind me, the elevator doors closed. Later that afternoon, I sat alone in a small deli near my office, watching the crowds hurry past the glass window. I thought about the encounter in the elevator. I didn't feel sad, and I didn't feel pity. I just saw reality clearly. I remembered the years that had passed. The extravagant galas, the disdainful glares, the cutting remarks designed to make me feel small and worthless. And I suddenly understood. There are people who are only comfortable standing next to you when you are beneath them. When you stand on equal footing, they feel threatened. And when you rise above them, they are entirely lost. That night, I received a text from an unknown number. Clara, it's Harrison. Seeing you today made me realize something. It's not that you changed. It's that I never deserved to walk to the end of the road with you. I read the message, locked my screen, and set the phone down. I didn't reply. Not because I was cold-hearted, but because I knew. Some epiphanies come far too late, and they no longer require an audience. I brewed myself a cup of hot tea and stood by the window. The Manhattan skyline glowed brilliantly, but it wasn't blinding. I thought about everything I had walked through, and my heart felt profoundly at peace. I no longer wished for anyone to feel regret. I didn't need anyone to turn back. I didn't need anyone's validation. All I needed was the knowledge that I had not allowed my past traumas to turn me into a bitter, vindictive person. And I had not allowed my old memories to drag me back to the place that once broke me. That encounter might have been a heavy emotional anchor for someone else, but for me, it was just the gentle, final period at the end of a long story. One evening, I sat alone in my small apartment for a very long time. I didn't do anything. I didn't read. I didn't look at my phone. I just sat watching the warm lamplight pool on the hardwood floor, listening to the distant hum of traffic fade in and out. I thought about the journey I had taken. I didn't think much about Harrison anymore. Not about Chloe. Not about my ex-in-laws. Those faces had retreated so far into the distance, like characters in a movie I had watched, lived inside for a while, and then walked out of the theater. I thought about the woman I used to be. The woman who constantly tried to please everyone, who always chose silence to keep the peace, who constantly told herself, just endure a little more, it'll be fine. Back then, I thought meekness was a woman's greatest virtue. I believed that if I was patient enough and forgiving enough, other people would eventually cherish me. But life taught me a brutal, incredibly expensive lesson. Being kind is not a mistake, but being kind without boundaries will get you trampled. I remembered the moment I was called unworthy. I remembered the feeling of being forced to sign the divorce papers. I remembered those cold, contemptuous eyes. At the time, I asked myself, am I really that terrible? Thinking back on it now, I understand. It wasn't that I was terrible, it was that I was in the wrong place, standing next to the wrong people. There are people who will only love you when you are weaker than them, when you need them, when you are forced to bow your head. But the second you stand up straight, the second you have your own voice, the second you are no longer terrified of losing them, they find you intolerable. I used to blame myself a lot. I blamed myself for not being stronger earlier. I blamed myself for letting things go too far. But then I realized, people only wake up when they have walked far enough into their own pain. If I had tried to be strong earlier, I might not have fully understood the reality. If I had walked away sooner, I might have lived with lingering what-ifs. But now, I have absolutely nothing left to regret. I learned how to say no without feeling guilty. I learned how to walk away without needing to cause a scene. I learned how to treat people with kindness without using my own self-respect as currency. I realized a very clear truth. Not everyone who walks out of your life is a loss. Sometimes, people leave so that you can finally live authentically. Maybe out there somewhere, Harrison is still paying the price for the wreckage he caused. Maybe he is still drowning in regret. But that is no longer a part of my life. My life now consists of mornings where I wake up without fear. It is eating dinner in total peace. It is coming home at night without having to interrogate myself about what I did wrong that day. I stood up and looked at myself in the mirror. The woman looking back wasn't perfect, but her eyes no longer averted their gaze. She no longer apologized for no reason. She no longer bowed her head. I smiled. And in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty, if I had to walk that same road all over again, I would still choose to leave. Because some marriages don't teach us how to love. They teach us how to save ourselves. One morning, I woke up very early. The sun hadn't fully risen, but the first light of dawn was slipping through the blinds, casting a soft glow on the floor. I brewed a cup of tea and opened the window to let the crisp air in. The city below was still half asleep, strangely quiet. I stood there for a long time. I wasn't thinking about the past. and I wasn't worrying about the future. I was just existing, purely in the present moment. I suddenly realized it had been a very long time since I could stand this still without feeling anxious, without the urge to rush and prove myself, and without the paralyzing fear of being abandoned or judged. I was no longer anyone's wife. I was no longer the daughter-in-law of a powerful dynasty. I no longer carried any title that others could use to measure my worth. I was just me. Someone once asked me, "After everything, do you feel like you won?" I thought about it for a long time before answering, "No, I just feel like I was brought back to life." Because winning or losing only matters when you are still competing. When you step completely off the playing field, there are no opponents left. Harrison, his family, the people who once looked down on me, they have all become a chapter of memories. Not beautiful ones, but necessary ones. If I hadn't lived through those years, I never would have discovered where my true value actually lies. I don't resent them, but I am not grateful to them either. I only carry one lesson with me. Never trade your self-respect to keep a relationship, because someone who truly loves you will never force you to bow your head just to stay by their side. My life continued normally, just like anyone else's. I worked, I took care of myself, I visited my parents occasionally. I planted a few more potted plants, read books, and journaled my thoughts. Nothing loud, nothing flashy, but deeply fulfilling. Some evenings I sit alone, look back at the path I've traveled, and smile, not because I am stronger than anyone else, but because I never betrayed myself a second time. If you are listening to this story, and you are a woman who has stayed silent for a very long time, a woman who thought she had to endure abuse just to keep her family together, a woman who constantly asks herself, "Am I just not good enough?" I only want to say one thing to you. You do not need to become covered in thorns to earn respect. You just need to dare to stand up straight and know exactly when it is time to leave. Some marriages don't end in screaming matches and tears. Some breakups don't require public spectacles. But it is in those quiet, definitive moments that a human being finally reclaims their soul. My story ends here. Not with a grand, triumphant victory, but with a brand new life. A place where I am allowed to live, to breathe, and to be a woman that no one, absolutely no one, will ever dare to look down upon again. The lesson of the story. In this life, there are women who are incredibly gentle, so gentle that they become accustomed to enduring, so gentle that they constantly believe, if they just try a little harder, if they just tolerate a little more, their families will be at peace. But this story reminds us of one glaring reality. Being kind is not a mistake, but kindness without boundaries will invite contempt. Silence is not always noble. Endurance does not always preserve happiness. And just because someone holds the title of husband or family does not give them the right to break your spirit. Some marriages do not teach us how to love. They teach us how to stand up on our own 2 feet, how to protect ourselves, and how to walk away when necessary. Leaving is not a failure. It is the realization that staying no longer holds any value. If you are a woman who has remained silent for far too long, who has constantly wondered if you just aren't good enough, remember this. You do not need to grow thorns to demand respect. You just need to know exactly what you deserve and have the courage to walk out of any room where you are not valued. If this story touched your heart, please press like to support the channel. Leave a comment below to share your thoughts. You never know, your story might just give someone out there the courage they need to take their next step. And please, don't forget to share this video with the people you care about, especially the women in your life who might need a gentle reminder that they deserve to live a life of absolute peace. Make sure to subscribe to so we can continue to share these slow, deep, and reflective stories about everyday life, human nature, and our shared destinies. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. We will see you in our next story.